In the history of American Presbyterianism, the name Beecher holds a special place. Now, Carolyn was a little disappointed this morning to find out it was Beecher with two E's. But Lyman Beecher was a clergyman in the early history of our country. And while pastor of the Presbyterian Church of East Hampton, New York, he gained a lot of notoriety over the sermon he gave in the death of statesman Alexander Hamilton. He was the leader in the progressive theological movement of the church in those days, but he was better known for his 13 children. His daughter was noted writer Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and an ardent abolitionist. All 7 of Lyman Beecher's sons became clergymen, the most prominent among them being Henry Ward Beecher. After serving 2 congregations in Indiana, in 1847 he became pastor of the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims in Brooklyn, New York, and he held that post for the rest of his life, 40 years. And he became one of the most famous pulpit orators and theologians of the day. His theological views were fairly orthodox, but he championed early causes that were incredibly progressive for that day. Beecher was one of the earliest and best-known supporters of the anti-slavery movement. He spoke in favor of the biological theory of evolution and the scientific historical study of the Bible, and a strong proponent of women's rights, especially the right to vote. And with that background and being part of such an accomplished family, Henry Ward Beecher could be expected to be a proud man. But Beecher was a strong advocate, though, of something else: humility. He once said, "Pride kills thanksgiving, but a humble mind is the soil out of which thanks naturally grows. A proud man is seldom a grateful man, for he never thinks he gets as much as he deserves." And so we begin this 3rd week of our season of Thanksgiving. It's focusing on humility. We're spelling out the word thanks. And of course, we had Worship Sunday last week. It's interesting that Beecher used the image of humility being soil from which pride and from which thanks grows, because the word humility is derived from the Latin word humus, which means earth. And the underlying idea of humility is being close to the ground. Today's scripture text from Colossians about humility as one of the 5 virtues is the one that Christians are supposed to live by, obviously. You're probably not that familiar with the reading. It's not one of the Bible's greatest hits. It's not an exciting story. There's no lovely parable to go with it that sticks it in our minds, or no great theological insight, just simply verses that say, this is how to live. This is what's required of us. These are the basics. And those are the kinds of verses that are the easiest to kind of glide over. After all, we already know how to live. Follow the 10 Commandments. Live the golden rule. We've heard the message loud and clear often enough. But what isn't clear right away when we read this Bible passage is why we're being told to live this way. And so we always like to go a little deeper. I want to look at those 2 phrases: bear with one another and forgive one another. They emphasize that the instructions are about how to live and how best to act with each other. Sometimes we get focused on the idea that the Bible is all about us as individuals. It's all about our individual needs, and there are elements of that in there. But primarily, the Bible is the story of people in community, whether it's the people of Israel or the later followers of Jesus Christ and the churches that Paul writes to. It's about how they live together. And the teachings of the Bible have always concentrated on how we live with each other. In Colossians, we're reminded that Paul is writing to a community of faith, a family of Christians. As I mentioned before, it seems so many of Paul's letters are about writing to churches who have problems. You notice there's not a single letter in there where Paul just writes, "How you doing? Things are going great for me. I heard you guys are doing well." And there he goes on his merry way. It doesn't make the Bible. Only the ones where things are really tough. For a long time now, there have been studies going on that show why people either do or don't go to church. There's all kinds of studies from different groups trying to figure out, why do people go to church, or why don't they? And for those that do join churches, at least in these days, The church provides two things that they're looking for: a place to be of service to others, or a place where they find people they can connect with. I can't begin to emphasize how important mission and fellowship are to people today. These studies recognize there's a need in all of us to do good things for other people. All people, even those who don't have much, need to be able to do something for another person. There was a nearby church when our last church Sue and I served in New Jersey. There was a nearby church that did a wonderful thing every Sunday morning. A number of them would gather before the service, and they would make sandwiches and box lunches, and then after the service, they would go out in the front steps of the church right there on the street, and they would pass those out to homeless people who would come by knowing there would be a meal for them. And we thought that was wonderful. But a friend of mine that was pastoring there shared a little story about there was a difficulty that came up. These people started coming to church. Now, that wasn't the problem. They were accepting and glad to have those folks there. But when it came time to pass the offering plate, they passed them by. They assumed they had nothing and so could give nothing. And my friend told how sad the face was of one man who had $1 in his hand, ready to put it in the offering plate, but they didn't even bother passing it down by them. Now, I'm sure they were thinking to themselves, we don't want to embarrass them because they don't have anything to put inside, but at the same time, there was somebody that wanted to give. For himself, he wanted to be able to do that. It's an important thing to be able to help others. Connection is just as important. If you look at the society we live in today, now this is, I'll have to say, many of the folks here at Grace Covenant are blessed. You don't realize it. Those of you that have family that are close by or grandkids that are close by, you're especially lucky because I really think the majority of folks these days don't have that experience. We were thrilled when we moved here because our daughter would now only be 8 hours away instead of 12. And yet I know there's some of you that have children and grandchildren that live on the coast or far northwest or down in Florida or whatever. And so we're not near the people we love and care about on a regular basis. Add to the fact that Americans work more hours than just about any other citizen of any industrialized nation. We work hard. But because of that, we also lose out on recreation time. And sometimes people feel isolated. I've now lived in where we are for about a year. And let's see, the guy across the street, I've met him twice. Once when we were raking leaves and looking at each other and chatting because, well, neither one of us wanted to be out there raking leaves. Another time walking our dogs. Otherwise, I've noticed this phenomenon on the street. If you stand out there, you see cars coming down, and all of a sudden, the garage doors go up, and the cars drive in, and the garage doors come down. You never see human beings. You only see cars going in and out. But you never see people because what else did we do besides getting rid of most of the sidewalks? We got rid of front porches and put decks in the back so nobody could see us. So now you can live in neighborhoods and never ever see anybody because we're all driving into our garage and going out back to enjoy ourselves on the back deck, putting up our privacy fences so no one sees us, no one bothers us, and we don't bother them. But that leads to a feeling of isolation for a lot of people. Think about that, though. You have people in the country who are isolated, don't know many people in the neighborhood, don't have friends or family nearby, and yet they're facing the same problems as everybody else. Deaths in the family, job loss, divorce, illness, depression, loneliness, you name it. And people today not only face the same great pressures people have felt for years, they do it in a sense of isolationism. People aren't made to live that way. God created us to be communal people. We need the touch and compassion of other human beings. And one of the reasons for the existence of the church is to provide that place. You remember that scene from Matthew's gospel where Jesus is teaching with his disciples and some other folks, and they come in and say, Jesus, your mother and your brothers are waiting outside to talk to you. And Jesus looks at them and says, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? He points to the disciples and says, here is my mother and here are my brothers. Anyone who obeys my Father in heaven is my brother or sister or mother. He wasn't denying his own family. He wasn't saying, I don't know who those people are. But he was saying that we have a deeper connection than we understand when we're part of a family of faith. We are brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers to each other. We're to love one another, to care for each other, and lift one another up. That's what having humility is. What is that golden rule? You shall love your neighbor. Thank you. Somebody recognized. That's what that. As yourself. Does that mean more than yourself? No. Or less than yourself? As yourself. Humility is that thing about being aware that all of us are equally loved by God. That we're not separated. One of us is not elevated above the other. Sue this morning had 4 brothers standing in line, and she asked them, okay, which one of you is the most important? Nobody dared answer. And she said, what if I said Harrison was? Well, it got a lot of grumpy looking faces. They didn't like that idea. God doesn't do that to us either. I mentioned the fact that I know that there are many of you who are charter members. And guess what? God loves you, but no more than the person that joined a year ago or 5 years ago. And if someone joins a year from now, we'll love them just as much, or we should. Just as we have children, we don't sit there and say, oh, you're the second child. I'm sorry, we don't love you as much as we did the first one, but we care about you. What are you laughing in the back there? Yeah, you got 2 brothers. Yeah, we don't think that much of that idea, do we? My daughter does think that's the way it works because she's number 1. But humility is about understanding that equality that we have in the eyes of God and that we're supposed to have with each other. Humility may very well be the basis for all those other virtues. The other one that Paul mentions in there is meekness. Now, in today's society, we're told to be assertive. Stand up there and be forward-thinking. Be out in front of everybody else. And meekness doesn't mean that you become a walking situation where you just let people walk all over you. Meekness is about, well, let's put it this way. Meekness is about courtesy, gentleness. Something I think we'd all agree we could use a little more of in the way we deal with one another. So I think we'd have to agree that it would be good to treat each other with meekness, compassion, kindness, and patience, and certainly humility. Now, occasionally we think of humility as something else. Humble to the point of not doing anything or saying anything. We used to be known as the frozen chosen. If you didn't know that, that has been a long-standing term towards we Presbyterians, because we're not exactly the most expression-laden people in worship. We stand up and sing, rarely crack a smile, unless, of course, you're the choir, because Rebecca's told you to smile. Smile. Look like you enjoy yourself. We sit through the service and we don't rarely smile, unless it's the children, and then we smile at them. And so we go through the whole service not saying much, and when it comes to leaving the church, we don't say much either. We've been taught that our actions speak louder than words. We don't have to talk about our faith because our actions speak louder than that. They do everything, all the talking we need to do. And guess what? That's mistaken. Humility and humbleness doesn't mean you don't ever say anything. Paul's talking about humility, and Paul is the biggest evangelist that there ever was. Paul established all those churches. It wasn't because he sat there and said, well, I'll just go out and let my actions do the talking. Paul was always speaking to people in church. Paul was speaking to people in the synagogues. Paul was speaking to people in the public squares about his faith. Not about what he did, but what had been done for him in Jesus Christ. That was humility. How many people were here last week for Worship Sunday? Fair number? I would think so. Did you enjoy yourselves? Amazing, wasn't it? You actually got together and did things to help others, and you felt good doing it. Do you ever think maybe God made us that way? I was talking with someone earlier, and I said it's surprising to find out School of Medicine did a study which showed that when you do things for other people, face to face, it has to be face to face. It can't be send a check to somebody or, send a letter somewhere. You have to do things face to face to help other people. And when you do, you get the same endorphins that you do if you run. Miles, the rest of the crew, you can quit running. Just do good things for other people face to face, and you'll get the same endorphins. They said people can literally get that same runner's high by doing good things for other people. And why do we think it would be so strange that God might create us to feel good when we do things for other people? If that's what God wants us to do, I can't imagine God said, let's make it real challenging. I want them to do good things, but I want them to feel lousy if they do that. Nah, probably not a good idea. And so God doesn't work that way. So you do good things for other people. It feels good. Can't you tell other people that's what it means? Can't you tell other people that that's how your faith affects you? An interesting little thing Sue sent to me yesterday, an article that said 82% of the people that you may know that are unchurched, in other words, they don't belong to another church, it doesn't mean they've never heard of church, but just don't go to one now, would willingly accept an invitation to come visit church if you ask them. But only 2% of us will ever ask anybody. Who here has asked somebody to join them in church in the last year? I like that. I get one. Christine actually got her hand up above her shoulder there, so I give her credit. So many others are, may. We can't even admit we do that. Come on. But so many of us don't. Why? Because we're too humble? That's not what humility is. People would love to be part of a church where they are lifted up, where they are held to the point that all of them are loved, that we give them an opportunity to be who they are as God created them, and yet also to serve other people. That's what we're supposed to do. When Paul talks about charity, compassion, kindness, patience, humility, meekness, they're just simply saying love people the way they want to be loved and the way you do too. And then our humility must not get in the way of letting us tell others that they will find that here at Grace Covenant. You are a family that cares for one another. You are a family that reaches out. When you leave this place, we tell you often that you are the ones bearing Jesus Christ into the rest of the world. And people will not experience God's hands or feet except by what you do when you go out. And yet at the same time, you are also to invite people in, to bring them in to be part of this place where we hope we lift them up, empower them so they too can go out. And that's when we are humble servants of God. Amen.